wars have been waged for many thousands of years and have led to the rise and fall of countless civilizations. It's often forgotten, though, that it can be individual battles that truly turn the tide of a conflict and change the path of history forever. From sieges that brought down cities to skirmishes that succeeded against the odds, I'm counting down 15 of the most fascinating historical battles. Let's start with number 15, the Fall of Constantinople in 1453. Taking place on May 29, 1453, the fall of Constantinople would mark the end of the Byzantine Empire and lead to the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a major power. Constantinople, which is now known as Istanbul, not Constantinople, was the capital of the Byzantine Empire and was one of the most fortified cities in the world. Its location on the Bosphorus Strait made it a vital link between Europe and Asia and a crucial hub for trade and culture. The Ottoman Turks, under the leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, wanted to conquer the city to solidify their control over the region and expand their own empire. Mehmed II, who was also known as Mehmed the Conqueror, was determined and managed to amass a huge and well-equipped army. There were reportedly about 80,000 soldiers, and they had advanced military technologies such as massive cannons that were capable of breaching the city's thick walls, something that had previously been thought to be impossible. The siege started on April 6, 1453, and despite the Byzantine defenders putting up a brave resistance, the relentless Ottomans gradually weakened the city's defenses. After almost 2 months, the Ottomans launched a final decisive assault that focused their numbers against the breaches in the walls, and they overwhelmed and exhausted the defenders. After more than 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire had fallen, and trade routes between Europe and Asia collapsed. It was as a result of this that many European nations began exploring to find alternative routes, such as Columbus's expeditions, and many Greek scholars fled to the West, carrying classical knowledge and texts that would help spark the Renaissance in Europe. Number 14, the Battle of Arbala, 331 BC. The Battle of Arbala, also known as the Battle of Gaugamela, took place on October 1st in the year 331 BC between Alexander the Great of Macedonia and Darius III of Persia, and it was a turning point in Alexander's campaign to conquer the Persian Empire. Gaugamela, which is located near the modern-day Erbil in Iraq, was chosen as the site for the battle by Darius III because of its flat terrain, which was ideal for deploying his large army and their war elephants. The Persian army, thought to be several 100,000 strong, significantly outnumbered Alexander's forces of around 47,000 men, including infantry and cavalry. Darius hoped that this and the open battlefield would guarantee him a victory. To further turn the odds in his favor, Darius had the ground leveled to make the chariots and war elephants even more effective. He positioned his troops in a traditional formation with a strong center and wings to surround Alexander's forces. But this didn't deter Alexander, who meticulously planned his approach. As the battle began, Alexander performed a series of maneuvers designed to draw the Persian forces out of position. One of his tactics included an oblique advance, with the right wing moving forward at an angle. This forced Darius to extend his line and create gaps in the Persian formation. Seeing an opportunity, Alexander led a cavalry charge into a space that had formed in the Persian center, a move that targeted Darius directly and caused panic and disorder within the Persian ranks. Darius, who feared being captured, fled the battlefield, and the Persian resistance began to collapse. The Battle of Gaugamela resulted in a comprehensive Macedonian triumph, and effectively, it shattered the Persian Empire's military power, and it paved the way for Alexander to advance into the heart of Persia, which went largely unchallenged, and it eventually allowed him to claim the title of King of Asia. Number 13, the Siege of Yorktown, 1781. The Siege of Yorktown, which took place in 1781, was a major turning point in the American Revolutionary War, which led to the ultimate defeat of the British forces, and it paved the way to American independence. The siege, which lasted from September 28th to October 19th, was the culmination of a series of strategic maneuvers and alliances that ultimately cornered British General Lord Charles Cornwallis and his troops. In the lead-up to the siege, the British military had been focusing on the southern colonies, where they hoped to rally loyalist support. General Cornwallis's campaigns in the south, however, despite some victories, failed to break the resolve of the American forces, and by the summer of 1781, Cornwallis had fortified Yorktown, Virginia, as a base of operations. American General George Washington saw an opportunity to trap Cornwallis there and worked with French General Rochambeau to do so by moving his troops from New York. This was part of a larger Franco-American strategy that had been strengthened by the French naval presence in the Atlantic. French Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse played an important role in this by defeating the British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake and cutting off Cornwallis's sea escape and resupply routes. The siege began on September 28th, when American and French forces, with around 17,000, arrived at Yorktown. They built siege lines and gradually encircled the British defenses. Over the next few weeks, the Allied forces bombarded British positions with artillery, weakening their defenses. On October 14th, American and French forces launched a successful night assault on two British redoubts, which were critical to the British defensive line. The capture of these positions sped up the end of the siege, and with his defenses crumbling and no hope of reinforcement or escape, Cornwallis began negotiations for surrender. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis formally surrendered to Washington, Rochambeau, and their forces, and the surrender at Yorktown effectively ended major combat operations in the American Revolution, with only a few further skirmishes taking place before the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, which officially recognized American independence. Number 12. The Battle of Zama, 202 BC. The Battle of Zama was fought near Carthage, which is modern-day Tunisia, and ended the Second Punic War to cement Rome's dominance over the Mediterranean. The battle saw the forces of Rome, led by Scipio Africanus, face up against the Carthaginian army under the command of the legendary General Hannibal Barca. The Second Punic War between 218 and 201 BC began with Hannibal's invasion of Italy, where he won several significant battles, including the infamous Battle of Cannae. Despite these victories, though, Hannibal was unable to make Rome surrender, and over time, the war shifted in Rome's favor as Scipio Africanus took on new tactics and began to target Carthaginian positions beyond Italy and Spain and Africa. By 204 BC, Scipio had successfully moved across North Africa and threatened Carthage directly. This made Carthaginians recall Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland. But when he did, he found himself in a tough strategic situation against a well-prepared Roman force. The two armies met at Zama, with Hannibal fielding a force of Carthaginian infantry, Numidian cavalry, and war elephants. Scipio, on the other hand, had Roman legions that had been added to by Numidian allies, being led by King Massinissa. The battle strategy of Scipio was crucial to his victory. Expecting Hannibal to use war elephants, Scipio arranged his troops in a manner that allowed lanes to open, which directed the charging elephants harmlessly through them. As the elephants charged, Roman troops either scared them into running back into Carthaginian lines or watched them run off into the distance. This gave Scipio a tactical edge and meant that Roman and Numidian cavalry managed to outflank and drive off the Carthaginian cavalry, leaving Hannibal's infantry exposed. Well, it didn't take long for the combined strength to break Hannibal's lines, and he was defeated. Hannibal himself managed to escape but could not salvage the situation, and the defeat was so comprehensive that it forced Carthage to sue for peace, leading to harsh terms that stripped it of its military power and overseas territories, marking the end of it being a major power. Scipio Africanus emerged as one of Rome's greatest generals, and had Hannibal been allowed to continue his campaign in Italy, it's quite possible the Roman Empire would have been unable to take hold in the way that it did in the following centuries. Number 11. The Battle of Marathon, 490 BC. The Battle of Marathon was a major conflict between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire, and it ultimately led to the rise of classical Greek civilization. The background to the battle is that the Persian Empire had undertaken an expansionist plan during King Darius I, and in 499 BC, several Greek city-states in Ionia, with the support from Athens and Eritrea, rebelled against this Persian rule. The insurrection, known as the Ionian Revolt, was eventually crushed, but it angered Darius, who vowed to punish the Greeks, particularly Athens, for their support of the rebels. In 490 BC, Darius launched a campaign to subjugate Greece, starting with the Cyclades and then targeting Athens. The Persian force, which was commanded by generals Datis and Artaphanes, landed at the Bay of Marathon, and even though the Athenians asked for help from Sparta, the reinforcements were delayed because of a religious festival, leaving Athens to face the Persians largely on their own. The Athenian army, led by General Miltiades, decided to encourage the Persians at Marathon, but it didn't look good for them as the Greeks with around 10,000 hoplites came up against a Persian army that, according to accounts from the time, was 3 times the size. The Athenians did, though, have the advantage of fighting on home terrain and were highly motivated to defend their city-state. Miltiades devised a clever strategy to overcome the Persian numerical superiority and strengthen the flanks of his formation while leaving the center relatively weak. As the battle commenced, the Greek flanks quickly overwhelmed the weaker Persian wings and then turned inward to attack the Persian center from both sides. This maneuver created chaos among the Persian ranks, and it led to a decisive Greek victory. It was also during the Battle of Marathon that the story of the run of Pheidippides comes from, where, according to legend, the Athenian messenger ran from Marathon to Athens over a distance of about 26 miles or 42 kilometers to announce the Greek victory, which inspired the modern marathon foot race. Number 10. The Battle of Hastings, 1066. The Battle of Hastings took place on October 14, 1066, and led to the beginning of a Norman rule in England. The battle saw the forces of William, Duke of Normandy, take on the army of the Anglo-Saxon King Harold II and completely change the course of history in the country. William believed he had been promised the English throne, but Harold had been recently crowned, so this left him with no choice but to take it by force. He assembled a large army, reportedly of around 7,000 men, including cavalry, infantry, and archers. In late September 1066, after successfully dealing with an invasion by the Norwegian king at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, King Harold received news of William's landing on the southern coast of England. Despite his forces being exhausted from the previous battle, Harold marched his army south to confront the Norman threat. The two armies met near Hastings. Harold's forces took a defensive position on Senlac Hill, making use of the high ground to their advantage, with an army made up of professional soldiers and militia, wielding axes, swords, and shields. William's army, though, was a varied mix of Norman, Breton, and Flemish soldiers, featuring a significant number of mounted knights and archers. The battle began with Norman archers attempting to weaken the English shield wall, but these initial volleys had little effect. William then ordered a cavalry charge, but the English defenders held firm. According to accounts, a turning point came when a rumor spread that something had happened to William, so to rally his troops he reportedly lifted his helmet to show his face, showing that he was okay and leading the fight. He decided upon a feigned retreat tactic which tempted segments of the English army into breaking their defensive formation to pursue the fleeing Normans. This proved effective, and by late afternoon, Harold's army began to lose their formation and were defeated within a few more hours. The Norman victory at Hastings was decisive. In the aftermath, William quickly moved to consolidate his control over England and was crowned King of England on December 25, 1066. His reign then saw significant changes in English society, governance, and culture, with the Normans introducing feudalism, building lots of castles to secure their rule, and changing English language by integrating Norman French. Number 9. The Siege of Stalingrad, 1942. The Siege of Stalingrad took place between August 23, 1942 and February 2, 1943, and proved to be one of the most pivotal battles of the Second World War. Stalingrad, which is now known as Volgograd, was an important industrial city next to the Volga River, which made it a vulnerable target for the Germans. Capturing Stalingrad would disrupt Soviet transport and communications, provide the Nazis with a strategic foothold in the Soviet Union, and deal a severe blow to Soviet morale. The German offensive, which was part of Operation Barbarossa, was led by General Friedrich Paulus and the 6th Army with the 4th Panzer Army. The initial German assault involved extensive bombing raids by the Luftwaffe, reducing much of Stalingrad to rubble. But despite the devastation, the Soviets, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, organized a defense within the city, using the ruined landscape to their advantage in close combat. The turning point to the siege came with the Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, which was launched on November 19, 1942. The operation aimed to surround the 6th German Army by attacking the weaker Romanian and Italian forces that were guarding the flanks. The Soviet movement succeeded, trapping Paulus and his troops inside Stalingrad. The Germans were then forced to face the harsh winter conditions, dwindling supplies, and relentless Soviet attacks. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold the city at all costs, forbidding any attempts to break out or surrender. Despite these orders, the situation inside the city became hopeless when faced with starvation, disease, and constant Soviet pressure. On January 31, 1943, Paulus, who had been promoted to field marshal by Hitler, eventually surrendered to the Soviets, and the city was back under Soviet control by February 2nd. This battle shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility, and it saw the beginning of a Soviet advance westward, with everyone now believing the German threat could in fact be defeated. Number 8. The Battle of Gaya, 203 BC. The Battle of Gaya was the end of a long conflict between the forces of Liu Bang, the founder of the Han Dynasty, and Zhang Yu, the leader of the Chu state. This battle marked the end of the Chu-Han contention, which was a 4-year civil war that followed the collapse of the Qin dynasty and led to the establishment of the Han Dynasty as the new ruling power. Liu Bang and Zhang Yu were two former allies who had been looked at to take advantage of the fall of the Qin dynasty. At first, Yu held the upper hand, having declared himself Homogeny King Western Chu, and giving Liu Bang the title of King of Han, which was a lesser position. Liu Bang's resilience, strategic mind, and his ability to gain popular and military support, though, gradually shifted the balance of power in his favor. Liu Bang and his advisors further devised a psychological warfare strategy to undermine Yu's morale. One of the most famous tactics used was the Chusong from four sides, where Han forces surrounded Yu's camp and sang folk songs from Chu. Hearing their homeland songs, Yu's soldiers became demoralized, believing that their territory had fallen to Liu Bang and that they had been abandoned. This tactic, along with sustained military pressure, led to the collapse and resolve of Yu's troops. Realizing the situation, Yu attempted a breakout with his remaining loyal forces. They were, though, intercepted and defeated. And while Yu managed to escape with a small group of followers, he was eventually cornered at the Wu River, where he accepted his loss, famously saying that he could not face his ancestors, having failed in his ambitions. Liu Bang became the undisputed ruler of China and established the Han Dynasty, which would become one of the most enduring and influential dynasties in Chinese history. Moving on to number 7, the Siege of Orleans, 1429. The Siege of Orleans took place between October 1428 to May 1429, and it was one of the most important moments in the 100 Years' War between England and France. At the time, the English forces, commanded by the Earl of Salisbury, Thomas Montagu, were looking to consolidate their control over northern France. With Orleans being on the Loire River, serving as a gateway to southern France, its capture would have allowed the English to advance further into French territory. The siege began in October 1428, with the English using a traditional method to starve the city into submission. They built a series of fortifications known as bastilles around Orleans to cut off supplies and reinforcements. Despite their initial progress, though, including successful assault on the outlying fortress of Les Tourelles, the English faced a determined defense led by Jean d'Aulnois. With leadership changes on the English side, the tactics began to be less effective, and things took a dramatic turn in April of 1429 with the arrival of Joan of Arc. The young peasant girl claimed to have been divinely inspired to lead France to victory, and her presence gave the French forces the boost they needed. She helped in military planning and engagements, and under her guidance, the French launched a series of offensives against the English bastilles. Joan herself led several of these, and after capturing the fortress of Les Tourelles, the English were forced to lift the siege and retreat. It was a major French victory, and one that would shift the momentum of the war in favor of the French, and establish Joan of Arc as a leader and a symbol of French resistance. Number 6. The Battle of Tours, 732 AD. The Battle of Tours, which was also known as the Battle of Poitiers, took place on October 10, 732 AD, and was a hugely influential moment in European history. It was fought between the Frankish forces led by Charles Martel and the invading Umayyad Caliphate's army, and would stop the northern expansion of Islam into Western Europe. During the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate had quickly moved across North Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula. Their forces, led by General Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, wanted to push further into the Frankish territories of what is now modern-day France. The Umayyads looked to take control of more land and spread Islam, which posed a direct threat to the Christian kingdoms of Europe. Charles Martel, known as the Hammer, was effectively the ruler of the Frankish territories, and seeing the threat posed by the Umayyad forces, he mobilized his army. Martel's forces were made up of primarily heavily armored infantry, and he chose a position near the city of Tours on high ground and heavily forested terrain, which provided a natural defense advantage. The battle began with a series of skirmishes and probing attacks by the Umayyads, who tried to break the Frankish lines. Martel's troops held firm though, using their terrain advantage and formations to fend off the assaults. According to historical accounts, the turning point of the battle came when rumors spread among the Umayyad ranks that the Frankish forces were attacking their camp and looting their supplies. This caused a large part of the Umayyad army to break ranks and retreat back to their camp. When he saw this, Charles Martel ordered a counterattack, which led to the collapse of the Umayyad forces and ultimate defeat. As well as preventing the invasion, this victory solidified Charles Martel's power, paving the way for the Carolingian dynasty and the eventual rise of his grandson, Charlemagne, who would become the first Holy Roman Emperor. This battle is often seen as a critical moment in preserving Christian Europe and its cultural and religious heritage. Number 5. The Battle of Cajamarca, 1532. The Battle of Cajamarca was fought on November 16, 1532, as part of the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. Francisco Pizarro, the leader of the Spanish expedition, had arrived in the region with a small force of around 168 men, including infantry and cavalry, and despite having far fewer people, the Spaniards had vastly superior weaponry, such as steel swords, crossbows, and firearms, as well as horses, which were unknown to the Incas. The Incas, led by Emperor Atahualpa, had thousands of warriors, but they were unprepared for the tactics and technology of the Spanish. Pizarro's strategy relied on cunning and deceit rather than open combat. Upon reaching Cajamarca, he sent an invitation to Atahualpa, who was camped nearby with his army, to meet peacefully in the town square. Atahualpa, confident in his power and intrigued by these strange visitors, agreed to a meeting, unaware of the Spanish plans for treachery. As Atahualpa entered the square, he was approached by a Spanish friar, Vicente Valverde, who tried to persuade him to convert to Christianity and accept the sovereignty of the Spanish king. According to Spanish accounts, when Atahualpa dismissed these demands, Valverde signaled for the attack. At Pizarro's signal, the Spanish forces launched a surprise assault. They unleashed their firearms, artillery, and cavalry upon the unarmed Incas, creating chaos and panic. The Incas, unfamiliar with such warfare and hampered by the crowded square, were unable to mount an effective defense. The Spanish quickly captured the city and Atahualpa himself and used it to demand a ransom from the Incas. They offered a room filled with gold and 2 more with silver for his return, which the Spanish melted down and divided amongst themselves. Despite receiving the ransom, they never released Atahualpa, which led to the collapse of the Incan Empire, paving the way for the Spanish expansion across the Andes and the ultimate establishment of Spanish colonial rule in South America. Number 4. The Siege of Baghdad, 1258. The Siege of Baghdad in 1258 was a major event that led to the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. Led by Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongol forces surrounded the city from January 29th to February 10th, 1258, in what was one of the most important battles of the medieval period. The Abbasid Caliphate, with Baghdad as its capital, was once a center of learning, culture, and commerce, representing the peak of Islamic civilization. By the 13th century, though, the Caliphate's power had weakened, and it struggled to defend itself against external threats. The Mongols, having already conquered territories across Asia, turned their attention to the Islamic regions under Hulagu Khan's command. Hulagu's campaign was part of a wider Mongol strategy to extend their influence and eliminate potential threats to their empire. Before advancing on Baghdad, Hulagu had already conquered several major cities and regions, leaving a trail of destruction. When he demanded Baghdad's surrender, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim refused, perhaps not realizing the Mongol threat or overestimating his city's defensive capabilities. After 12 days of intense fighting, the Mongols entered Baghdad on February 10, 1258. The city's grand libraries, including the famed House of Wisdom, were destroyed, resulting in a tragic loss of knowledge and cultural heritage. Books and manuscripts were thrown into the Tigris River, reportedly turning its waters black with ink, and everything that Baghdad had once stood for had been destroyed. This was such a loss that it saw the end of the Islamic Golden Age and was a significant blow to Islamic civilization. The city's destruction disrupted the trade routes and all of the intellectual exchanges that had flourished under the Abbasids. There were wider effects too, as the siege showed the overwhelming military power of the Mongol Empire and its capacity for destruction, causing fear across the Muslim world. Over time, though, many of the Mongols who settled in the Middle East converted to Islam and contributed to the region's cultural and intellectual life, but it never quite restored Baghdad to its former glory. Number 3. The Battle of Waterloo, 1815. The Battle of Waterloo, which was fought on June 18, 1815, was an influential event that saw the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte and ended over 2 decades of war that had taken place across the continent. The battle, near the town of Waterloo in present-day Belgium, was fought by the Seventh Coalition, which was an alliance of European powers including Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia that had decided to work together to end Napoleon's rule once and for all. With the Duke of Wellington leading the British and General Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher leading the Prussians, Napoleon aimed to defeat the coalition forces separately before they could unite. He first moved against the Prussians, achieving a tactical victory at the Battle of Ligny on June 16, 1815. It wasn't a total success though, as the Prussian forces managed to retreat in good order and move to support Wellington. On the morning of June 18th, the battlefield near Waterloo was set. Napoleon's forces, approximately 72,000 strong, faced Wellington's army of around 68,000. The terrain played a critical role, as the battlefield was a shallow valley with Wellington troops positioned on a ridge. The ground was muddy from heavy rains, which made it much more difficult for cavalry and artillery to be effective. Napoleon began the battle with an artillery bombardment, hoping to weaken Wellington's center. Things didn't work out as well as had been hoped, so late in the day, Napoleon launched a major infantry assault on the center of Wellington's line, known as the attack on La Haye-Sainte. The French failed to break through the Allied center, and a later attack by their cavalry was similarly ineffective. Things turned late in the afternoon when Blücher's Prussian forces arrived on the field and reinforced Wellington's troops. The Prussians attacked Napoleon's right flank, forcing him to divert troops to counter this new threat. The combined pressure from both forces began to overwhelm the French. In a final desperate move, Napoleon committed his elite Imperial Guard to breaking Wellington's center. This charge was repelled by the British and Allied forces, leading to the Guard's retreat and the collapse of the French army by evening, leading to the end of the Napoleonic Wars and a period of relative peace in Europe, known as the Concert of Europe. Number 2. The First Battle of the Marne, 1914. The First Battle of the Marne took place between September 6 to September 12, 1914, and while it stopped the German advance into France, it would pave the way for the entrenched stalemate that would become synonymous with the First World War on the Western Front. At the start of the war, the German army's Schlieffen Plan was a strategy that was designed to quickly defeat France by sweeping through Belgium and northern France, and then to capture Paris. By early September 1914, the German forces had moved deep into French territory, and the French capital was under imminent threat. Seeing how the German First and Second Armies had overextended, though, the French saw an opportunity to counterattack. The German right flank was vulnerable due to the quick advance that had created gaps between their army groups. This, along with logistical challenges and exhaustion among the German troops, set the stage for a decisive battle. On September 6, the Allies launched their first counteroffensive along the Marne River. The French Sixth Army attacked the German First Army from the northwest, while the BEF and the French Fifth Army engaged the Germans head-on. This was done so quickly that as many as 6,000 troops were taken to the front lines by Parisian taxis, which bolstered the French forces just at the right moment. The Germans, realizing the threat, attempted to regroup and counter the Allied attacks. However, the pressure from multiple directions proved too much. By September 9th, the German High Command decided to withdraw to more defensible positions, effectively abandoning their push towards Paris. There was a long-lasting consequence, though, as in the aftermath of the battle, the German and Allied forces began to dig extensive trench systems, setting the stage for the protracted trench warfare that would become so common in the war. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan meant that Germany would now have to fight a prolonged two-front war, as they also faced Russia's forces in the east. Number 1. The Battle of Gettysburg, 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg between July 1st and July 3rd, 1863, is often said to be the turning point of the American Civil War. The confrontation was between the Union and Confederate armies and would turn the momentum of the war towards a Union victory. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee, began its second invasion in the North in the summer of 1863, following their victory at Chancellorsville. Lee aimed to move the war out of Virginia, draw Union forces away from the southern states, and potentially influence Northern public opinion to push for peace. The Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major General George G. Meade, moved to intercept Lee's forces. The battle began on July 1st, when Confederate forces clashed with Union cavalry to the west of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Union cavalry held off the initial Confederate attacks until infantry reinforcements arrived. Throughout the day, the fighting intensified, drawing in more troops from both sides. By the end of the day, Union forces had been pushed back through the town to establish strong defensive positions on the high ground south of Gettysburg. July 2nd saw intense fighting as Lee sought to break the Union lines by attacking both flanks. On the Union left, Lieutenant General James Longstreet led the assaults on positions such as Little Round Top, the Wheat Field, and the Peach Orchard. Despite fierce fighting, Union forces managed to hold their ground. On the Union right, attacks on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill were simply repelled after heavy fighting. The third and final day of the battle, July 3rd, is most famously known for Pickett's Charge. Lee, believing the Union center on Cemetery Ridge to be vulnerable, ordered an assault. This frontal attack, involving around 12,000 Confederate soldiers, was preceded by a massive artillery bombardment aimed at softening Union defenses. The bombardment, though, was largely ineffective, and when the Confederate infantry advanced, they were met with fierce resistance. The charge failed disastrously and effectively ended the battle. In the aftermath, President Abraham Lincoln delivered the famous Gettysburg Address on November 19, 1863, where he redefined the purpose of the war, emphasizing the principles of liberty, equality, and democracy. He understood the significance of the Union's cause and the importance of preserving a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you to our channel members.